He's trash. My ex-husband said it loud enough for everyone at the Christmas table to hear, and what surprised me most wasn't the insult itself, but the sound that came right after it, my own children laughing. For a moment the room seemed to shrink around the long oak dining table that had once belonged to Richard's parents, the same table where we had carved turkeys and opened gifts for more than 30 years. The smell of roasted ham, cinnamon sweet potatoes, and fresh pine from the Christmas tree filled the house, but suddenly none of it felt warm anymore. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 67 years old, and that night was supposed to be the first Christmas dinner I'd attended with my family since my divorce from Richard 5 years earlier. I had almost decided not to come. But Daniel convinced me. Daniel Brooks. The man sitting beside me at that table. The man my ex-husband had just called trash. I remember gripping my fork a little tighter when Richard leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk of his, the one he used to wear whenever he thought he had won an argument before it even began. The crystal glasses clinked softly as someone shifted their elbow, and the soft Christmas music playing in the living room drifted into the dining room like nothing unusual had happened. But everyone had heard it. Emily, my daughter, covered her mouth while laughing. Jason, my son, shook his head like he couldn't believe the situation either, though the smile on his face told a different story. I felt the heat rising behind my eyes, but I kept my posture straight. Daniel had warned me about moments like this. Let people show you who they are, he had said once while we were sitting on a park bench outside the public library. I hadn't fully understood what he meant back then. I think I was beginning to understand it now. Earlier that evening, when we first arrived, everything had seemed polite enough. The Collins house looked exactly the same as it always had. The white columns on the porch. The wreath hanging on the red front door. The warm yellow lights glowing through the windows like something out of a holiday movie. Richard had opened the door wearing a navy sweater and that same confident expression he'd carried through most of our marriage. Margaret, he said, as if my name were simply a line in a script he'd rehearsed. Then his eyes moved to Daniel. And this must be him. I introduced Daniel calmly. This is my fiancé. I could feel the room react even though no one said anything at first. My sister-in-law paused while setting plates on the table. Emily raised her eyebrows. Jason looked Daniel up and down with the kind of curiosity people reserve for strangers they're not sure how to categorize. Richard asked the question that everyone else was clearly thinking. So Daniel, what exactly do you do? Daniel didn't hesitate. He never does. I work as a janitor at Westbrook High, he said in that steady voice of his. No apology. No embarrassment. Just the truth. The silence that followed was short but noticeable. You could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway. I remember thinking the moment would pass. That we'd move on to dinner and small talk and pretend we were all still a normal family for one evening. But Richard never liked letting moments pass. He leaned forward, folded his hands together, and laughed quietly before shaking his head. Margaret, he said, glancing around the table as if inviting the audience to enjoy the show, you're engaged to a janitor? That's when the laughter started. And that's when he said it. He's trash. I expected Daniel to react. Anyone would have. Instead, he simply smiled. Not a defensive smile. Not an embarrassed one. Just calm. Almost patient. Like a man watching a story unfold exactly the way he expected it to. And in that moment, I realized something strange. Daniel wasn't surprised by any of this. Not Richard. Not my children laughing. Not the tension filling the room. It was as if he had walked into that Christmas dinner already knowing how the evening would end. Daniel did not raise his voice after Richard said those words. He did not defend himself. He simply rested his hands calmly on the edge of the table and looked around the room as if he were studying something quietly. I remember noticing how steady he looked compared to everyone else. The candles in the center of the table flickered slightly, casting soft shadows across the faces of people I had known for most of my life. My daughter Emily was still smiling in that awkward way people do when they are not sure whether the joke has gone too far. Jason leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, clearly amused by the situation. Richard poured himself another glass of red wine and lifted it slightly, like a host enjoying his own performance. For a second I thought about saying something. I thought about reminding Richard that we had once promised to treat each other with respect, even after the divorce. But the words never came out. Instead I heard Daniel's voice, calm and even. He said, "It is all right." Just that. 3 simple words. He turned slightly toward Richard and smiled again, the same patient smile that had puzzled me earlier. Richard laughed softly and shook his head. "You see, Margaret," he said, glancing toward the rest of the table, "that is exactly what I mean. A man who cleans floors at a high school and still thinks he belongs at this table." Emily chuckled again, and I noticed my sister-in-law quickly focusing on her plate as if she wanted no part in the conversation anymore. The Christmas tree lights reflected in the dining room window behind them, blinking slowly in red and gold. The whole scene felt strangely unreal, like watching a memory instead of living it. I looked at Daniel, expecting some hint of embarrassment or anger. But he looked relaxed. Almost curious. He glanced at the turkey in the center of the table and then back at Richard as if they were simply discussing the weather. "Mr. Collins," he said politely, "how long have you owned Collins Development Group?" The question sounded so ordinary that for a moment nobody reacted. Richard frowned slightly, surprised by the change in direction. "What kind of question is that?" he asked. Daniel kept his tone steady. "Just a simple one." Richard leaned back again, clearly enjoying the attention. "Since 1994, he said proudly. "Built it from the ground up." Jason nodded like he had heard the story 100 times. Emily took a sip of wine and watched Daniel carefully now, as if she sensed that something in the room had shifted. I remember feeling a strange tension building in my chest. Daniel had asked similar questions before. Not many, but enough that I recognized the pattern. Quiet questions. Simple questions. The kind that sound harmless until you realize they are leading somewhere. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "That is impressive," he said. "Running a company that long takes discipline." Richard smirked again. "It does. Something most people never learn." I felt my hands resting in my lap beneath the table, fingers intertwined so tightly that my knuckles had turned pale. The conversation felt like it was balancing on the edge of something I could not yet see. Daniel reached for his water glass and took a small sip before speaking again. "And when was the last time you reviewed the ownership structure of the company?" The question hung in the air. This time nobody laughed. Even Richard looked slightly confused. Across the table Emily slowly lowered her glass and glanced at Jason. The room had grown very quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of Christmas music drifting from the living room. I looked at Daniel again, and that was when I noticed something I had not seen before. It was not just calmness in his expression. It was certainty. The kind of quiet certainty that only appears when someone already knows the answer to the question they just asked. I could feel every pair of eyes at the table slowly shifting toward Daniel after that question. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead he gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they think someone has said something foolish. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the polished oak table that had seen decades of family dinners. "Ownership structure," he repeated, raising one eyebrow. "Why would a janitor care about something like that?" The word janitor came out slowly, stretched just enough to remind everyone in the room of the role Richard believed Daniel played in this story. A few people at the table smiled nervously, unsure whether the conversation was still a joke or something else entirely. I kept my eyes on Daniel. I had learned over the past year that he rarely asked a question without a reason. Even so, I did not yet understand what that reason might be. Daniel nodded politely, as if Richard had given a completely reasonable response. "It is just a habit of mine," he said calmly. "I like understanding how things work. Especially companies that have been around for a long time." Richard swirled the wine in his glass and shrugged. "Well then, you can relax. Colin's development group is doing just fine. Always has." Jason nodded in agreement from across the table. "Dad has been running that company longer than I have been alive," he said with a hint of pride in his voice. Emily added softly, "It is kind of the backbone of the family." I noticed the way Daniel listened carefully to each of them, almost as if he were collecting their words. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He simply waited until the small wave of conversation settled again. Then he asked another quiet question. "And the board meetings," he said, "they are still held every quarter, correct?" Richard frowned again. The question was not aggressive, but it was oddly specific. "Of course they are," Richard replied. "What kind of company would we be if we skipped those?" Daniel gave a small nod of acknowledgement. "That makes sense." He reached for his water glass again, took a small sip, and set it down gently on the table. The room felt unusually still now. Even the laughter from a television somewhere in the living room seemed distant. I realized that Emily had taken her phone out and placed it beside her plate, her attention drifting between the conversation and the glowing screen. Jason looked slightly less amused than he had earlier, his smile fading as he tried to follow where Daniel's questions were leading. I could feel a strange mixture of confusion and anticipation building inside me. Daniel turned his attention back to Richard. "Then you probably received an email earlier today," he said evenly. "From the firm handling the shareholder documentation." Richard's expression changed almost immediately. The confidence in his posture did not disappear, but it shifted slightly, like a man adjusting his balance after a step he did not expect. "What email?" he asked. Daniel tilted his head just a little, as if considering the question. "The one regarding the updated share distribution," he said calmly. The words settled over the table like a quiet snowfall. Emily looked up from her phone now, her brows pulling together in confusion. Jason straightened slightly in his chair. Richard stared at Daniel for a long moment before letting out a short laugh again, though this one sounded thinner than the last. "You are talking nonsense," he said. "You have no idea how corporate ownership works." Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead he glanced briefly toward me, his calm expression unchanged. In that moment I felt something shift inside my chest. It was not fear. It was the growing realization that Daniel had not walked into this dinner to defend himself at all. He had walked in already knowing exactly what was about to happen next. I watched Richard carefully as Daniel spoke those words. For the first time that evening the confident rhythm of Richard's reactions slowed down. He still looked certain of himself, but the easy smirk had faded just enough that anyone paying attention could see the difference. He placed his wine glass back on the table with a soft tap and leaned forward slightly. "Shareholder documentation," he repeated, almost as if he were testing the phrase. "That is a big phrase for someone who pushes a mop at a high school." Jason gave a short chuckle, but it sounded weaker this time. Emily did not laugh at all. She was looking down at her phone again, her fingers moving across the screen as if she were searching for something. Daniel remained completely calm. He rested one hand lightly beside his plate and glanced around the table before speaking again. "Westbrook High has very clean floors," he said politely. "I take pride in my work." Richard rolled his eyes. "That is wonderful. Truly inspiring." The sarcasm in his voice floated across the table like a cold draft through an open window. I could feel the tension building in the room even though nobody raised their voice. The candles flickered slightly as someone shifted in their chair. My sister-in-law quietly reached for the basket of dinner rolls and then seemed to reconsider, placing it back where it was. Daniel looked back at Richard with the same steady expression he had worn since the beginning of the evening. "The email should have arrived this afternoon," he continued calmly. Around 3:15, if I remember correctly. Emily suddenly stopped typing on her phone. Her eyes moved quickly across the screen and then lifted toward her father. "Dad," she said slowly, "did you get an email from Bennett and Walsh today?" Richard turned toward her, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Why would you be checking my emails?" he asked. Emily shook her head quickly. "I am not checking your emails. I am just saying that firm represents several investment groups. Their filings show up online sometimes." Jason leaned forward slightly now, curiosity replacing the earlier amusement on his face. "What filings?" he asked. Emily turned the phone slightly so he could see the screen. "Corporate disclosures," she said quietly. "Sometimes when ownership shares change." Richard let out another short laugh, though it sounded forced now. "This is ridiculous," he said, looking back at Daniel. "You walk in here, sit at my table, and start inventing stories about my company?" Daniel did not react to the accusation. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and calmly removed his phone. The movement was slow and deliberate, the kind that makes people watch even when they do not want to. He placed the phone on the table in front of him and tapped the screen once. "I am not inventing anything," he said softly. The glow from the screen reflected faintly against the polished wood of the table. For a moment nobody spoke. Even Richard seemed unsure whether to continue laughing or to pay attention. Daniel turned the phone slightly so Richard could see it. "This is the confirmation email," he said. "The one your attorneys sent earlier today." Richard frowned and leaned forward to look at the screen, though he did not pick up the phone. Jason glanced over as well, and I noticed the color slowly draining from his expression. Emily's eyes widened as she read the first few lines displayed on the screen. I could not see the entire message from where I sat, but I recognized the letterhead at the top. Bennett and Walsh. One of the most established corporate law firms in Boston. Richard straightened slightly in his chair, his expression tightening in a way I had not seen before. "What exactly am I supposed to be looking at?" he asked. Daniel met his gaze calmly. "The document confirming the transfer of controlling shares," he said. The words were quiet, but they seemed to echo across the table. Nobody laughed. This time. Nobody moved. And in that sudden silence I realized that the entire evening had slowly shifted into something none of them had expected. No one at the table spoke after Daniel said those words. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. Richard stared at the phone for several seconds, as if the meaning of what he was seeing refused to settle into place. Then he leaned back slowly in his chair and let out a quiet laugh that sounded more confused than confident. "This is some kind of joke," he said. "A very strange one, but still a joke." Daniel did not move the phone. He simply left it on the table between them. The soft glow of the screen reflected against the polished surface like a small spotlight in the middle of the room. Jason leaned forward first. His chair made a faint scraping sound against the hardwood floor as he shifted closer. He looked down at the screen carefully, his eyes scanning the text. I watched the color drain from his face the same way it had drained from Richard's earlier. "Dad," Jason said slowly, "this is from Bennett and Walsh." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "Of course it says that. Anyone can type a law firm's name into an email." Emily shook her head quietly. She turned her phone again and looked at the same information she had been reading earlier. "No," she said softly. "This filing is real." The word filing seemed to echo through the room. My sister-in-law looked up for the first time in several minutes. Even Richard stopped smiling. Emily swallowed once and continued, her voice calm but uncertain. "There was a disclosure posted this afternoon," she said. "A controlling interest in Collins Development Group was transferred through an investment acquisition." Richard's expression hardened immediately. "Transferred to who?" he asked sharply. Emily looked down at her screen again, then slowly lifted her eyes toward Daniel. The room felt impossibly quiet. I could hear the faint ticking of the hallway clock again, marking each passing second. Emily spoke the name carefully, almost as if she did not trust her own voice. Daniel Brooks. No one laughed after that. Jason leaned back in his chair slowly, his arms dropping to his sides as he stared across the table at the man he had been mocking just a few minutes earlier. Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment he simply stared at Daniel without speaking. I could see the gears in his mind turning, searching for a way to dismiss what he had just heard. Finally he shook his head. That is impossible, he said firmly. You cannot just buy control of a company like that. Daniel folded his hands calmly in front of him. You are right, he said. You cannot do it quickly. Richard leaned forward again, the irritation returning to his voice. Then how exactly did you manage it? Daniel looked around the table for a moment before answering. His expression remained gentle, almost thoughtful. Over time, he said quietly. Small investments. Quiet partnerships. Patience. I felt a strange warmth spreading through my chest as I listened to him speak. Not because of the revelation itself, but because of the calm dignity in the way he carried it. He had not raised his voice once. He had not insulted anyone in return. He had simply allowed the truth to arrive on its own. Jason looked back at Daniel with a completely different expression now. The amusement from earlier had disappeared entirely. You are serious, he said slowly. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Richard pushed his chair back a few inches, the legs scraping softly against the floor. The confident host who had welcomed us into the house earlier now looked like a man who had just realized he had been standing on unstable ground. Why, he demanded. Why would you do something like that? Daniel met his gaze calmly. Because sometimes, he said, the quietest people in the room are the ones who pay the closest attention. He paused for a moment, then added in the same steady voice, and sometimes the people who call others trash forget to check who is really standing in front of them. The words were not angry. They were simply true. And for the first time that evening, no one at the Christmas table had anything left to laugh about. I could see the moment the room changed. It was not loud. No one slammed a hand on the table. No one raised their voice. But the energy that had filled the house earlier that evening had quietly disappeared. Richard sat there staring at Daniel as if the man across from him had suddenly become someone else entirely. The Christmas lights reflected in the dining room window behind him, blinking softly in red and gold, but no one seemed to notice them anymore. Jason looked down at the table for a moment, his fingers resting against the edge of his plate. A few minutes earlier he had been laughing. Now his expression looked uncertain, like a person replaying a conversation in his mind and realizing it might not have gone the way he thought. Emily was still holding her phone, but she was no longer reading the screen. She was looking directly at Daniel now. So you bought the company, she said slowly, as if testing the sentence out loud. Daniel shook his head gently. Not exactly, he said. I invested in several groups that already owned shares. Over time those investments grew into something larger. His voice was calm and steady, the same tone he had used all evening. There was no pride in it. No attempt to impress anyone. Just a quiet explanation. Richard leaned back in his chair again, but this time the movement felt different. Earlier it had been the posture of someone in control of the room. Now it looked more like someone trying to find balance after losing it. You expect us to believe that a school janitor somehow built enough capital to take over a company like mine, he asked. Daniel smiled slightly, though there was no mockery in the expression. I expect you to believe the paperwork, he replied. Jason glanced again at the phone resting on the table. How long, he asked quietly. Daniel turned his attention toward him. How long what? Jason swallowed once. How long have you been doing this? Daniel thought for a moment before answering. About 12 years, he said. The number hung in the air longer than anyone expected. 12 years. I realized then that the story Daniel had lived before I met him was far bigger than anything he had ever explained to me. Richard rubbed his forehead slowly, his fingers pressing against his temple. "This is ridiculous," he said again, but the words sounded weaker now. "You cannot seriously think that changes anything." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "It changes perspective," he said calmly. The room went quiet again. I could hear the faint hum of the heater running somewhere in the house, pushing warm air through the vents. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights briefly sweeping across the living room wall before disappearing again. Emily placed her phone down beside her plate and folded her hands together. "Dad," she said softly, "if the filing is real then there is probably a board meeting soon." Richard did not respond immediately. His eyes were still fixed on Daniel. Finally he asked the question that seemed to have been waiting in the room since the moment Daniel revealed the email. "Why did you come here tonight?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened during the evening. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead he looked toward me for a brief moment, his calm expression softening just slightly. Then he turned back to Richard. "Margaret invited me," he said quietly. Richard scoffed. "That is not what I meant." Daniel nodded once, acknowledging the deeper meaning behind the question. "I know," he said. He paused for a moment before continuing. "I came because family dinners are supposed to reveal something about the people sitting at the table." No one interrupted him. No one laughed. The entire room listened. Daniel rested his hands lightly on the table again, the same way he had at the beginning of the night. "Sometimes," he added gently, "they reveal more than anyone expected." And as he said those words, I realized. The evening was not finished yet. Not even close. The room remained quiet long after Daniel finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the silence. It was the kind of silence that forces people to sit with their own thoughts. Richard shifted in his chair again, but this time the movement felt restless rather than confident. He picked up his wine glass, then set it back down without taking a sip. I had known that gesture for more than 30 years. It meant he was thinking carefully about his next move. Across the table, Jason rubbed his hands together slowly as if trying to warm them, though the house was not cold. Emily stared at the candle in front of her plate, the small flame reflecting in her eyes. For the first time since we had arrived, no one looked amused anymore. Daniel sat beside me with the same quiet composure he had carried all evening. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. It was almost strange how normal he looked sitting there while the entire atmosphere of the room had shifted around him. Richard finally cleared his throat. "So what exactly are you saying?" he asked. His voice was still firm, but it had lost the sharp edge from earlier. Daniel turned his head slightly toward him. "I am not saying anything complicated," he replied calmly. "I am simply explaining the situation as it exists now." Richard leaned forward again, his fingers pressing flat against the table. "And what situation would that be?" he asked. Daniel did not hesitate. "The situation where Collins Development Group now answers to a different majority shareholder." The words settled across the table like a quiet verdict. Jason let out a slow breath and looked down again. Emily shifted in her chair and folded her hands together tightly. Richard stared at Daniel for several seconds without blinking. "You think that gives you power over this family," he said finally. Daniel's expression softened slightly, as if the question itself revealed something important. "No," he said gently. "Family is not something anyone owns." That answer seemed to confuse Richard even more. He leaned back again, studying Daniel carefully as though trying to uncover a hidden motive. "Then why bring it up tonight?" he demanded. Daniel looked around the table once more before answering. His eyes moved from Jason to Emily and then back to Richard. "Because tonight someone decided to measure a person's worth by their job," he said quietly. The room grew even stiller than before. Daniel continued speaking in the same calm voice. And I have spent most of my life watching people make that mistake. Jason shifted in his chair again and looked up. You really worked as a janitor all this time? He asked. Daniel nodded once. Yes. Jason seemed puzzled. But if you had all this money, Daniel finished the thought for him. Why keep doing it? Jason nodded slowly. Daniel smiled faintly. Because honest work is never something to be ashamed of, he said. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep into the room. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking. Dad, she said quietly, maybe we should just, her voice trailed off before she finished the sentence. Richard remained focused on Daniel. You walked in here tonight letting everyone think you were nothing, he said. Daniel met his gaze calmly. I walked in here exactly as I am, he replied. Richard shook his head slowly. No, he said. You walked in here with a secret. Daniel considered that for a moment. Perhaps, he admitted. Then he added softly, but the reactions around this table were not caused by my secret. No one argued with that. Not Jason. Not Emily. Not even Richard. The truth hung quietly between all of them. And as I sat there beside Daniel, watching the room finally understand what had just happened, I realized something important. The man they had called trash earlier that night had never needed to defend himself. All he had done was give them enough time to reveal exactly who they were. I watched the room carefully after Daniel finished speaking. Something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The same dining room that had felt loud and crowded an hour earlier now felt smaller, quieter, almost thoughtful. The candles had burned lower, their soft flames leaning slightly as warm air moved through the room. Outside, a light breeze brushed against the windows, and the faint sound of Christmas music continued drifting from the living room like a distant memory of how the evening was supposed to feel. Richard remained seated at the head of the table, but the posture he carried now was different from the confident host who had greeted us earlier. His shoulders were still straight, yet the certainty behind them had thinned. He looked at Daniel again, studying him carefully as though trying to place him inside a story that suddenly no longer made sense. Jason cleared his throat quietly and glanced at his sister before speaking. So the company really reports to you now, he asked. Daniel did not respond with pride or drama. He simply nodded once. The board still makes decisions, he said calmly. But yes, the majority shares are under my management. Jason leaned back slowly, absorbing the answer. Emily remained silent, her eyes fixed on the table for several seconds before she finally looked up. I did not know any of this, she said softly. Daniel gave a small understanding smile. Most people did not, he replied. Richard let out a slow breath through his nose, the sound carrying a mixture of frustration and disbelief. You could have said something when you walked in, he muttered. Daniel shook his head gently. That would have changed the evening, he said. And I was curious to see it without any introductions. The honesty of that sentence seemed to settle over the table like a quiet mirror reflecting everything that had happened earlier. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing gently against my chest. For years I had sat at this same table trying to keep peace between people who measured each other by success, money, titles. Tonight the old pattern had quietly broken apart. Richard rubbed his chin slowly and looked down at the tablecloth as if searching for the right words. So what now? He asked finally. Daniel did not hesitate. Now nothing changes unless it needs to, he answered. Richard raised his eyes again. You expect me to believe that? Daniel's voice remained steady. I do not expect anything, he said. I simply prefer respect over assumptions. Jason shifted again in his chair and looked toward me for the first time since the conversation began to turn. Mom, he said quietly, did you know about this? I shook my head slowly. No, I answered honestly. And that was the truth. Daniel had never introduced himself to me with titles or numbers. He had introduced himself by bringing coffee to a quiet park bench on a cool morning and asking if I wanted to share the sunlight. Emily leaned back slightly and let out a small breath. "That explains a lot," she murmured. Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" Emily hesitated before answering. "It means maybe we judged someone too quickly." No one responded to that statement right away. The words simply rested in the room like a truth that had been waiting to appear. Daniel reached for his water glass and took a small sip before setting it down again. He looked at Richard calmly and said something that seemed simple but carried more weight than anything else spoken that night. "People reveal their values in ordinary moments," he said quietly. "Especially when they believe no one important is watching." The statement was not harsh. It was not angry. It was simply clear. And in the silence that followed, I realized the evening had reached the point where everyone at the table understood exactly what had happened. The laughter from earlier felt like something that belonged to a completely different night. I looked around the table slowly, letting the quiet settle into something real instead of uncomfortable. The dinner plates were still half full, the mashed potatoes cooling beside untouched slices of turkey. Hours earlier the room had been full of cheerful holiday noise, but now the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the hallway wall. It was strange how quickly a moment could reveal things that had been hidden for years. Richard finally pushed his chair back slightly and stood up. The movement caught everyone's attention immediately. For decades he had been the center of this house, the person who controlled the rhythm of every conversation and every holiday gathering. Even now, old habits made everyone watch him. He placed both hands on the back of his chair and looked across the table at Daniel. The expression on his face was not the confident one he used during business meetings. It looked more thoughtful, almost careful. "You said you prefer respect over assumptions," Richard said slowly. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." Richard glanced briefly at Jason and Emily before returning his gaze to Daniel. "Then perhaps I should start there," he admitted. The sentence seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including me. Richard was not a man who apologized easily. He cleared his throat and continued speaking in a quieter tone than usual. "I judged you too quickly tonight," he said. "I saw the uniform and assumed I understood the entire story." Daniel did not rush to answer. He simply listened, his calm expression unchanged. Richard gave a small nod to himself as if acknowledging something difficult. "That was my mistake." Jason shifted in his seat and looked down for a moment before speaking as well. "I laughed earlier," he said quietly. "I should not have done that." Emily nodded slowly beside him. "Neither should I," she added. Daniel looked at each of them in turn, not with triumph or satisfaction, but with a quiet patience that somehow made the room feel lighter. "We all make quick judgments sometimes," he said gently. "The important part is recognizing them." Richard exhaled slowly and sat back down again. The tension that had filled the room earlier seemed to loosen, like a knot finally beginning to untangle. I looked at Daniel beside me and felt the same calm strength I had noticed the first day we met. He had never needed to prove anything to anyone. Not with anger. Not with pride. Just with quiet truth. Jason leaned forward again and rested his elbows lightly on the table. "So what happens with the company now?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Tomorrow there will be meetings," he said. "Reports, decisions, the same work that always happens." Jason nodded slowly. "And tonight?" Daniel glanced around the room at the half-finished meal, the flickering candles, and the Christmas decorations glowing softly through the doorway. Then he said something so simple that it seemed to dissolve the last bit of tension still lingering in the air. "Tonight we finish dinner." For a moment no one spoke, and then Emily let out a small breath that sounded almost like a laugh of relief. Jason reached for the serving bowl and began passing the potatoes again. Richard poured a little more water into his glass and leaned back quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by a thoughtful silence. As the plates moved around the table again, I realized something important about the entire evening. The biggest revelation had not been Daniel's success or the company shares or the surprising emails. The real revelation was much simpler. Respect does not grow from titles or job descriptions. It grows from character. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one who never needed anyone else to recognize it.